There is a map sitting in a European archive that should not exist. Not because it was forged, not because it was mislabeled, but because what it shows, with careful, deliberate lines drawn by hands long turned to dust, contradicts nearly everything we have been taught about the political geography of the early 19th century. It is dated 1812. It is authentic, and for reasons that no official historian has ever fully explained, almost no one talks about it. That silence is where this story begins. In the spring of 2003, a researcher named Dr. Marcus Velthium was cataloging a collection of uncategorized cartographic materials at a regional archive in Göttingen, Germany. The materials had arrived decades earlier, transferred from a private estate after the death of a prominent collector, and they had sat in sealed boxes, unexamined, unlabeled, for the better part of half a century. Velthium's task was routine: identify, date, and register each item. He expected to find trade maps, maritime surveys, perhaps some decorative prints of modest historical value. What he found instead was a large format map, approximately 90 centimeters by 60 centimeters, printed on heavyweight laid paper with watermarks consistent with early 19th century German production. The cartouche in the lower left corner bore a date, 1812. The projection methodology and the style of geographic notation were consistent with the period. The ink oxidation patterns, confirmed later by 2 independent conservation laboratories, placed its production firmly within the first decade of the 19th century. None of that was unusual. What was unusual was what the map depicted. Across a broad swath of Central and Eastern Europe, from the eastern bank of the Elbe River, stretching northeast through what is today Poland, Belarus, and into the Baltic regions, the 1812 map outlined a single, continuous political entity. It was marked with boundary lines of the kind cartographers of the era used exclusively for recognized sovereign states. It had a name. The name, rendered in a formal Gothic typeface, translated roughly as the Confederation of the Northern Reaches. Here is the problem. No confederation by that name, or any name approximating it, appears in any major treaty of the Napoleonic era. It is absent from the Congress of Vienna records of 1814 and 1815, despite the Congress producing the most exhaustive cartographic settlement of European borders since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. It does not appear in the diplomatic correspondence of the major powers, not in the British Foreign Office archives, not in the Austrian Staatskanzlei, not in the preserved communications of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Politically speaking, it did not exist. And yet here it was on a map produced in 1812, drawn with the quiet confidence of something that someone, at some time, considered entirely real. Historians are accustomed to absence. Documents burn.
Archivflut.
Victorious powers erase what they prefer not to remember. The obliteration of a political entity from the official record is not, in itself, unprecedented. The history of the 19th century alone contains dozens of short-lived polities, provisional governments, and reorganized territories that left only the faintest traces in the academic literature. But those entities, however minor, leave some trace. A treaty clause, a minor official's letter, a newspaper column, a coin. The Confederation of the Northern Reaches left none of this, or rather, none that had been publicly acknowledged. When Velthium began to search carefully and systematically, he found something unexpected. He found not a wall of silence, but what he later described, in a monograph published in 2007 by a small academic press in Heidelberg, as a deliberate blankness. The phrase is precise. A wall of silence implies absence. A deliberate blankness implies that something was there, and was removed. He began to find the edges of it. In the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, in a collection of miscellaneous correspondence from the Napoleonic administrative apparatus, there are 17 letters written between 1810 and 1813 that reference, obliquely, an arrangement with unnamed representatives of the Northern Territories. The letters do not name the entity. They do not describe its boundaries. but they reference scheduled courier routes, customs exemptions, and, in one letter dated March 1812, a phrase that translates as the ongoing question of recognition. Recognition. That is the language of diplomacy. That is the language used when an entity exists and the question is whether to formally acknowledge it. In the Latvian State Historical Archive in Riga, there are property records from the same period, 1810 to 1814, that reference a category of land ownership described in the original documents as held under Northern Compact authority. The phrase appears in 43 separate records across 11 distinct localities. Then, in 1815, the phrase vanishes. The records continue, but the category disappears. The properties are redistributed. The compact, whatever it was, is not mentioned again. In a private collection in Warsaw, a set of correspondence between two Polish merchants, written in the years 1811 and 1812, contains what appears to be a reference to traveling under Northern Passage, a phrase that historians of commerce have interpreted as shorthand for a recognized trade corridor with its own legal protections. One letter, dated July 1812, notes with evident frustration that the passage will soon be closed, not because of natural impediment, but because of the turn in affairs. The turn in affairs. Napoleon's catastrophic invasion of Russia began in June of 1812. The year 1812 is one of the great hinges of modern history. Before June of that year, Napoleon Bonaparte commanded an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the borders of the Russian Empire. He was the dominant political force on the continent. His allies, his client states, and his satellites covered most of the European landmass. After the Russian campaign, everything began to unravel. The Grande Armée, which crossed into Russia with approximately 450,000 men in June 1812, returned with fewer than 100,000 by December. The losses were catastrophic, not primarily from battle but from cold, starvation, and disease. The political consequences were immediate. Client states began to waver. Alliances fractured. Within 3 years, Napoleon was in exile on Elba, and the map of Europe was being redrawn at Vienna by men who had every interest in erasing the complicated, provisional arrangements of the Napoleonic years. Political entities that had existed under French patronage or tolerance, or that had developed in the peculiar power vacuums created by Napoleon's reorganization of the continent, were particularly vulnerable. Many were simply absorbed into the newly consolidated states. Their records were transferred, reclassified, or quietly lost. Their officials took new oaths to new governments. Their names faded from the correspondence. If the Confederation of the Northern Reaches had existed, even partially, even provisionally, 1812 would have been precisely the worst year in which to exist. The 1812 map was not unsigned. In the lower margin, in the careful hand of a professional draftsman, there appeared a name, F. W. Haesler, Geograph, Leipzig. Friedrich Wilhelm Haesler was a real person. He was born in Leipzig in 1771 and died there in 1829. He produced, over the course of his working life, a documented catalogue of approximately 60 maps, city plans, regional surveys, commercial route maps, most of which are held in the collections of the Leipzig City Library and the Saxon State Archive. He was not a major figure. He was a competent professional cartographer, the kind of man who drew what he was paid to draw and made his living from precision rather than imagination. His surviving correspondence, held in a small collection at the Leipzig Archive, contains a letter written in the autumn of 1814, 2 years after the date on the map, in which he refers, in a single, almost parenthetical sentence, to the commission from the northern representatives, now rendered moot by the settlement of affairs. He says nothing more about it. The letter is primarily concerned with an invoice dispute over a city plan of Dresden. The commission from the northern representatives. Haesler was not a man who drew imaginary places. He drew things that existed for people who needed them documented. And in 1812, someone, Someone with enough resources to hire a professional Leipzig cartographer needed the Confederation of the Northern Reaches documented on a formal, large-format map. Consider what is visible when you stand back and look at the accumulated fragments together. A professionally produced map, dated 1812, depicting a coherent political entity across a large swath of Central and Eastern Europe. Diplomatic correspondence in French archives referencing unnamed northern representatives and the question of recognition. Property records in Riga using a legal category, Northern Compact Authority, that disappears entirely after 1815. Merchant correspondence describing a recognized trade corridor that closes abruptly in the summer of 1812. A cartographer's letter referencing a commission from the northern representatives. And then silence. A complete, comprehensive silence across every official archive of every major European power. This is not the pattern of a thing that never existed. This is the pattern of a thing that was erased. The researchers who have examined this material, a small, careful group including Velthium, the Baltic historian Professor Erika Leinonen of the University of Helsinki, and the Polish archivist Tomasz Krzyżanski, who published a preliminary analysis in 2011, have been cautious in their conclusions. None of them claims certainty. All of them note the same fundamental problem: the absence of a smoking gun. There is no treaty of dissolution, no letter from a minister explaining the decision to erase, no memoir from an official who participated in the suppression of the record. What there is, instead, is the shape of a space, the outline of something that was removed. There is one more piece. In the collection of a small regional museum in Vilnius, Lithuania, there is a journal. It belonged to a merchant named Janis Berzins, a Baltic trader who operated between Riga, Königsberg, and Leipzig in the early 19th century. The journal covers the years 1809 through 1817, and most of it is exactly what you would expect from a merchant's diary. Prices, distances, the names of inns, notes on road conditions, occasional complaints about customs officials. In the entries from 1811 and early 1812, something different appears. Berzins writes, on 3 separate occasions, about meetings with officials he describes only as the council representatives. He describes these meetings as routine, arrangements for passage, verification of compact membership, the payment of a fee that he records in a column alongside other commercial expenses, as though it were no more remarkable than a toll. He writes, in one entry from February 1812, that the compact now covers most of the northern roads, and that traveling under its authority saves considerable time at the crossings. He is describing a functioning administrative system. Not a rebellion, not a conspiracy, a bureaucracy. The kind of quietly operational arrangement that handles paperwork and collects fees and keeps its records somewhere. After the autumn of 1812, Berzins never mentions the council representatives again. He does not explain why. He simply stops. The roads are the same roads. The crossings are the same crossings. But the compact is gone, and he does not remark upon its disappearance, which is itself a kind of remark. The silence of a man who has learned that certain things are no longer worth writing down. So where does this leave us? There are several possible explanations for everything described here, and none of them are mutually exclusive. The most conservative interpretation holds that the Confederation of the Northern Reaches was a proposed entity, a political project that never achieved formal recognition, that existed only in the plans of its architects and the commission map they ordered from a Leipzig cartographer. Under this view, it died before it fully lived, consumed by the catastrophe of Napoleon's Russian campaign before anyone could formalize its existence in the documents that would have made it legible to history. A second interpretation holds that the Confederation was real and functional, not as a sovereign state in the full modern sense, but as the kind of loose administrative compact that was common in the Napoleonic period. A recognized zone with agreed-upon rules, a fee structure, and operating officials. Under this view, it was not erased so much as reclassified, absorbed into the new territorial order after 1815 without anyone needing to formally acknowledge that it had existed. A third interpretation, and the one that the scattered evidence most uncomfortably suggests, is that the Confederation was real, was recognized in practice if not in name by at least some of the major powers, and was deliberately and systematically removed from the record after 1815. Not because it threatened anyone, but because its existence complicated the clean narrative of the Vienna settlement, which required Europe to appear as a coherent set of legitimate monarchical states with clear and ancient sovereignties. History, in this reading, was not rewritten. It was simply not written at all. The map is still in the archive in Göttingen. It has been photographed, catalogued, and placed in an acid-free sleeve. It will not decay. What it depicts, whatever it was, whatever it meant to the people who commissioned it and the cartographer who drew it, has not been recovered. The council representatives that Janus Berzens paid his fees to have no names in any accessible record. The officials who drafted the letters in the French archive remain anonymous. The 43 property records in Riga that referenced the Northern Compact have been filed under new categories by successive archivists who did not know what to do with them. Velthium retired from his position in Göttingen in 2019. In an interview published in a small German journal of archival studies, he was asked what he thought the map really showed. He paused for a long time before answering. "I think," he said, "that it shows something that people built carefully, and that they had reason to believe would last. And I think that when it didn't last, the reasons for that were considered too complicated or too convenient to explain." Perhaps he is right. Perhaps the Confederation of the Northern Reaches was simply a casualty of one of the most convulsive periods in European history. A provisional arrangement swept away by the tide of events, mourned by no one powerful enough to preserve its memory. Or perhaps there are other maps, other letters, other journals sitting in other unsealed boxes in other archives, waiting for another researcher with the patience to look. The deliberate blankness, after all, has edges. And edges, if you trace them carefully enough, have a shape. And a shape, even an invisible one, is a kind of answer.